The morning of October 3, 1955, broke over Apia harbor like warm champagne, sunlight spilling gold across the water, laughter bouncing off the corrugated roofs of the little town, and every soul on the wharf seemed to have come out just to watch MV Joyita slip her lines and wave her off with the kind of send-off usually reserved for brides or royalty. She was a pretty thing, 69 feet of scarred teak and stubborn hope, built in 1931 for Hollywood millionaires who wanted to fish tuna in style, later a patrol boat in Pearl Harbor, now patched together with cork and prayers and owned by a big-hearted Englishman named Roland Wilson who called her, "my unsinkable girl," the way other men call their daughters princess. The cork was the real magic, 20 tons of it packed into every void, lining the hull, stuffed into the bilges, enough to keep her floating even if every plank gave up the ghost, and the islanders loved telling tourists how she'd once survived a direct hit from a Japanese shell and bobbed back up grinning. That morning she wore her scars like party medals. Fresh white paint on the wheelhouse, a new red ensign snapping from the jackstaff, and a crowd of children chasing along the pier shouting, "Joyita! Joyita!" because saying her name felt like saying lucky. Captain Thomas Henry Dusty Miller stood on the bridge wing in a clean khaki shirt, pipe clenched between teeth that had chewed through typhoons and divorce papers alike, waving back with the easy grin of a man who believed the ocean still owed him a favor. 56 years old, thick gray hair, eyes the color of storm glass. Dusty had sailed everything from copper schooners to Liberty ships, and he loved Joyita the way a broke cowboy loves a horse that never throws him. Beside him, leaning on the rail with the lazy confidence of a man who'd never lost at cards, was Dr. Alfred "Doc" Parsons, surgeon, fisherman, and the only passenger who'd brought a leather medical bag instead of rum. Tall, sunburned, mustache like a broom, Doc was heading to Tokelau to pull teeth and deliver babies for free because that's the kind of reckless saint he was, and every nurse in Apia had kissed him goodbye at least twice. Down on the afterdeck the passengers milled like guests at the best party they'd never planned to leave. 25 souls in all, a rainbow stitched together by sunshine and shared cigarettes. There was Roland Wilson himself, red-faced and laughing, already half-cut on gin and telling anyone who'd listen that this run would finally pay off the mortgage. His Samoan wife Tua, serene in a pink pulatasi, cradling their toddler on one hip while scolding Roland in liquid syllables that made everyone grin harder. Old George Fears, the mate, former merchant marine with tattoos older than most of the crew, humming a Greek lullaby while he coiled lines, and little Charlie the cook, barely 20, apron flapping, waving a ladle full of curry like a battle standard because he'd promised the Tokelau kids the best damn fish curry they'd ever tasted. The rest were a carnival of faces, a government radio officer named Jim McFarlane who kept patting the brand new transmitter like it was a puppy, a young couple from New Zealand on honeymoon, her head on his shoulder, both of them drunk on each other and cheap rum, a nun in full habit clutching a crate of Bibles and smiling like she'd already forgiven the ocean for whatever it planned, even a boxer from Fiji with a broken nose and a grin wide enough to shame the sun, heading home after a fight. He swore he'd let the other guy win for 50 pounds. They were teachers, fishermen, mothers, drunks, dreamers, 25 hearts beating loud enough to drown out the engine's cough, and every one of them believed the worst thing that could happen was seasickness or sunburn. The tide was right at 10:17 a.m. when Dusty rang finished with engines, and the lines came in with wet slaps. Children ran alongside shouting, "Good luck," until the pier ended and the water took over. Tua threw a lei that landed perfectly around Roland's neck and he kissed it like it was her mouth. Someone started singing S.A. lei, and the whole wharf joined in, voices rising over the chug-chug-chug of Joyita's old gray marine diesel until the song itself seemed to push her clear of the reef. From the shore she looked like a postcard, white wake curling, flags snapping, people waving from every porthole, and the harbor master wrote in his log, "MV Joyita sailed 1,017 hours, 25 souls, destination Tokelau, weather fine, spirits high." He underlined spirits high, twice because even he felt it, that electric certainty that nothing bad could touch a ship carrying that much joy. But the Pacific is a jealous lover and it doesn't share. By noon the land was a green smudge and the real ocean opened its arms, deep, lazy swells the color of peacock feathers, flying fish skimming alongside like silver commas in a love letter. Dusty set the course north-northeast, 270 miles to Fakafo Atoll, 2 days if the engine behaved, 3 if it sulked. Below decks Charlie clanged pots and the smell of curry drifted up the companionway until even the nun asked for seconds. Doc Parsons set up a makeshift surgery on the chart table, sharpening scalpels and joking that the only operation he expected was removing fishhooks from foolish fingers. The honeymooners disappeared into the forward cabin and weren't seen again until dinner, flushed and giggling. Roland produced a ukulele and taught the boxer a filthy rugby song that had the children clapping hands over their ears while pretending not to listen. The sun slid west, painting everyone gold, and when the stars came out, they came out hard, millions of them close enough to touch. So bright the deck glowed and nobody bothered with lamps. Someone passed a bottle of teacher's whiskey and the stories grew taller. Roland swore he'd once caught a marlin so big it towed Joyita backward for 6 hours. Doc claimed he'd sewn a man's ear back on with dental floss and rum for anesthetic. Dusty just smiled around his pipe and said the sea had taken everything from him except this ship, and he planned to die aboard her with a smile and a full belly. That first night the radio crackled with voices from half the world away, Suva, Honolulu, even a freighter off Auckland, and Jim McFarland sent cheerful position reports signed Joyita, all well, curry excellent. The air smelled of salt and diesel and frangipani someone had tucked behind Tua's ear, and when the baby started crying Roland rocked him on the bridge until the child fell asleep against his chest, tiny fist curled around his father's thumb. Dusty took the wheel at midnight, humming under his breath, and the stars wheeled overhead like slow lanterns. He logged the mileage, checked the bilge, dry as a bone, cork doing its job, and wrote in the deck log, midnight, glass steady, crew and passengers happy. God looks after drunks in Joyita. He meant it as a joke, but the ocean has a way of taking jokes seriously. The second day dawned pink and perfect. Porpoises raced the bow, leaping clear of the water in silver arcs, and Charlie swore they were smiling. The honeymooners emerged long enough to eat mangoes on the foredeck, juice running down their chins while the nun read them psalms and tried not to laugh. Doc fished off the stern with a handline and pulled up a wahoo so big it took 3 men to haul aboard, and the boxer posed for photographs holding the fish like a knockout trophy. Roland opened the last crate of beer and declared a half holiday. Nobody bothered with shirts, the sun was warm, the wind steady at 12 knots, and the engine sang its reliable 2-cylinder song. At noon Dusty took a sight and marked their position, 120 miles north of Samoa, right on the rum line, and Jim sent another cheerful radio message, Joyita noon position 10°48S 173°12W, all well, wahoo for dinner, tell Tokelau save the dancing girls. The operator in Apia laughed so hard he forgot to log the time. By late afternoon the skies started doing that thing tropical skies do when they're bored, cotton puff clouds stacking higher, shadows racing across the water like schools of dark fish. Dusty sniffed the air and frowned. The glass had dropped 2 millibars since dawn, nothing serious, but enough to make an old sailor's bones ache. He told George to double-lash the deck cargo, 4 tons of copper and sacks, some empty gas drums, a crate of medical supplies Doc had sweet-talked out of the hospital, and they spent an hour wrestling ropes while the sun burned their backs and the boxer held the baby so Tua could help. When the last knot was tied the wind freshened from the northeast, still gentle, but with an edge now, like a smile that shows too many teeth. Dusty lit his pipe and watched the horizon the way a man watches a drunk stranger walk toward his daughter. That night the stars hid. Clouds rolled in thick as wool, the air turned heavy, and the first raindrops arrived fat and warm, drumming on the deck like impatient fingers. The party moved below, voices softer now. Someone started a poker game on the mess table, and Charlie served wahoo and coconut milk that made even the nun ask for thirds. Doc told stories about operating by hurricane lamp in the Solomons while bombs fell, and every time thunder rumbled the children jumped and the adults laughed too loud. At 2,200 hours Jim tried to send the evening position report but got only static. He blamed sunspots, tinkered with the set, and promised to try again at midnight. Dusty took the wheel himself, rain hissing on the windows, and logged, weather closing in. Barometer 1008 and falling. Passengers bedded down. Engine steady. He underlined steady because the old gray had started to cough, just a hiccup, nothing a little choke wouldn't fix. But the cough came again, deeper this time, and the RPM needle fluttered like a trapped moth. By 0200 the wind had teeth and the sea had fists. Joyita pitched hard, cork keeping her buoyant but not gentle. Plates slid, the baby cried, and Tua sang him to sleep in Samoan while Roland paced the saloon clutching a rosary he didn't know how to use. Doc handed out seasick pills like communion wafers, and the honeymooners clung to each other in a corner looking suddenly very young. Dusty fought the wheel, pipe long gone cold, eyes fixed on the compass as it spun lazy figure eights. The radio spat nothing but white noise now, and Jim's knuckles were white on the key. At 0347 Dusty made the decision every captain dreads. He turned tail and ran before the storm, heading south for shelter, because Joyita might be unsinkable but she wasn't unbreakable and 25 lives weighed more than any schedule. He logged the course change, wrote heavy seas running for Apia, and told George to wake him if anything at all, felt wrong. The last anyone saw of the Joyita under her own power was a faint green running light disappearing into the rain, swallowed by a darkness that didn't bother with goodbyes. At 0600 Jim was supposed to send the dawn position report. The radio room stayed silent. By noon Apia started calling. By nightfall the harbor master's underline beneath, spirits high, looked like a scar. And somewhere out there in the black 25 hearts that had beaten so loud they drowned out the engine simply stopped. No mayday. No flare. No wreckage. Just the ocean folding its hands and smiling the way it smiles when it's already won. The merry voyage was over before it began, and the Pacific, jealous, hungry, ancient, closed over Joyita like a mouth. But mouths leave teeth marks, and teeth leave stories, and somewhere in that warm, terrible darkness the cork still held, the radio still screamed a message no one heard, and 25 ghosts began learning how loud silence can be when the party lights go out forever. November 10, 1955, 5 weeks and 3 days after the Joyita vanished into the night like a dropped coin into deep water, and the Pacific had already started forgetting her name. The search planes had given up, the newspapers had moved on to Elvis and Suez, and in Apia the harbor master kept Dusty Miller's last logbook in a locked drawer because every time he opened it the words, "Running for Apia," looked wet, as if the ink itself was crying. Then, on a morning so calm it felt like the ocean was holding its breath, the little trading schooner Tuvalu out of Funafuti broke the horizon north of Fiji and nearly ran bow first into a nightmare floating on mirror blue water. Captain Ben Taroa was sipping tea on the bridge when the lookout screamed a word in Rotuman that roughly translates to dead thing walking. Ben dropped the mug, porcelain shattering like a gunshot, and grabbed the binoculars with hands that suddenly remembered how to pray. There she was, MV Joyita, lying on her port side like a drunk against the lamppost, masts pointing at the sea instead of the sky, half submerged, yet still afloat, cork doing its stubborn miracle, bobbing gently as if the ocean itself was rocking her to sleep. The white paint was gone, scoured away by sun and salt until the timber looked flayed, and across the exposed hull someone had written in rust-red letters tall enough to read from a mile, "Joyita, unsinkable." The word unsinkable dripped like it had been painted yesterday. Ben brought Tuvalu alongside so gently the fenders barely kissed, and the first thing that hit them was the smell. Not rot, not decay, but something sharper, hot copper pennies, iodine, the inside of a butcher's fridge left open too long. The second thing was the sound. A low, rhythmic metallic moan coming from somewhere deep in the wreck, like a heartbeat made of iron. The third thing was the radio. It was screaming. Not static, not voices, just one long, continuous distress tone, the emergency carrier wave on 2182 kHz that every mariner knows means we are dying. Except it had been screaming for 37 days straight, batteries long dead, generator silent, yet the speaker up on the bridge wing was still pouring out that electronic wail, rising and falling with the swell as if the ship itself was breathing pain. Ben's radio officer, a kid from Auckland named Wairmu, crossed himself and whispered, "She's calling for her dead, skipper. Let's leave her to it." But Ben Taroa had a daughter the same age as Roland Wilson's little boy, and some doors you open even when every instinct screams to nail them shut. They put 3 men across, Ben, Wairmu, and a deckhand named Mikiti who swore he wasn't afraid of ghosts until the plank touched Joyita's rail and the screaming changed pitch, dropping half an octave like a woman recognizing her murderer. The deck slanted at 45 degrees, green water sloshing ankle-deep over the starboard scuppers, and every footstep left bloody prints that weren't there a second later. The first thing Ben saw was the radio shack, door hanging off one hinge inside a scene frozen mid-nightmare. The transmitter key was taped down with surgical tape, Doc Parsons tape, the roll still lying on the chart table, forcing the set to broadcast that endless distress, and someone had scrawled across the bulkhead in grease pencil, "Mayday, mayday, we are sinking, help us please God." The letters started neat, ended in frantic slashes that tore through the paint into bare steel. Wairmu reached to switch it off and the second his finger touched the key the screaming stopped, so suddenly his ears rang with the silence, and from somewhere below came a single deliberate knock, like a fist on coffin wood. They moved aft, boots squelching through water the color of rose wine. The saloon was a shipwreck inside a shipwreck. Tables bolted to the deck but chairs scattered like toys after a tantrum, plates of curry fused to the wood by salt and thyme, a child's sandal floating upside down with a tiny foot still buckled inside. No wait, just the buckle catching light, thank Christ. The honeymooner's cabin door hung open and the mattress was soaked dark, not with seawater but with something thicker that had dried to the color of blackberry jam. On the pillow someone had arranged a lei of frangipani, petals still pink, still fragrant, as if the ocean had tucked them in for a nap they'd never wake from. Makiti found the blood first. Not pools would have been merciful. But streaks, handprints sliding down bulkheads, fingerprints on the overhead like someone had tried to claw through the deck above, a perfect outline of a child's bare foot printed in red on the ceiling directly above the Wilson family berth. The cork had kept her afloat, yes, but it had also trapped every drop of whatever happened, turned the Joyita into a sealed bottle holding a message no one wanted to read. Ben tasted iron at the back of his throat and realized he'd bitten his tongue hard enough to bleed. Then they found the doctor's bag. It sat on the mess table exactly where Doc Parsons had left it, lid open, contents arranged with surgical precision. Scalpels lined up like silver soldiers, morphine syringes still in their wrappers, and in the center a neat stack of bandages, 4 of them, each one soaked through with blood so fresh it hadn't even browned at the edges. The top bandage had been unfolded and laid flat, and someone had pressed a perfect adult handprint into the center, fingers splayed, lifeline clear, the kind of print you leave when you're trying to stop arterial spray and realize too late you're holding your own wrist. Ben recognized the ring mark on the 4th finger. Dusty Miller's gold wedding band, the one he'd worn even after the divorce because some promises outlast the paperwork. Wiremu gagged and stumbled outside to vomit over the rail, but the vomit never reached the sea. It hung in midair for a heartbeat, then slid backward across the deck and soaked into the planking like the ship was drinking it. They searched every compartment, every locker, every chain locker where a child might hide. Nothing. No bodies. No bones. No scraps of clothing snagged on nails. 25 people had simply been erased, leaving only their terror behind. The lifeboats were gone, all 4 of them, davits swung out and falls dangling, but the ropes ended in clean cuts made by something sharper than any knife aboard. The engine room was dry to the knees, bilge pumps still turning slowly on residual current, and the gray marine diesel sat cold and perfect, not a drop of water in the cylinders as if it had simply decided to stop breathing. On the throttle quadrant someone had carved with a scalpel, "We tried to go home." The last thing they found was the logbook floating face down in the chart room bilge. Ben fished it out with shaking hands. The final entry, written in Dusty Miller's neat captain's hand, was dated October 4th, 0330, 3 hours after the course change, heavy seas. Engine failed. Taking on water faster than pumps. Cork holding but something wrong below. Doc says bleeding won't stop. Radio taped down. If you find this, tell Tua the baby smiled in his sleep. Tell Roland I kept my promise. Tell the sea it can't have them all. Below that, in different ink, Doc Parsons' fountain pen blue, a single line added at an angle. They're not in the water anymore. They're in the walls. Ben Taroa stood on the slanted bridge with the logbook clutched to his chest and looked out at the empty horizon. The sun was setting, painting the water the same color as the bandages, and for one heartbeat he thought he saw them, 25 figures standing along the rail of the sunken starboard side, waving the way they'd waved leaving Apia, smiles too wide, eyes too dark. Then the sun dipped and then there was only rust and cork and the soft slap of wavelets against a hull that refused to die. He ordered his men back aboard Tuvalu and cast off so fast the rope burned his palms. As they pulled away the radio started screaming again, louder this time, and Ben swore he heard words buried in the carrier wave, not Morse, not English, just a child's voice repeating, "Daddy, it hurts," over and over until the distance swallowed it. They reported the find by radio to Suva, voice shaking so badly the operator asked him to repeat 3 times. The authorities came, Navy, police, men in white shirts who took photographs and measured blood and never once looked anyone in the eye. They towed Joyita to port stern first, half submerged, still bleeding from scuppers that had no right to bleed. The inquiry lasted months, filled with experts who used words like inconclusive, and baffling, and mass psychosis. But every night in Apia the harbor dogs howled at the slip where she lay, and fishermen refused to tie up near her after dark. The cork was stripped out, sold for scrap, and still she floated in the cradle, refusing to sink even when they opened every seacock. They finally cut her up for firewood in 1959, but the teak screamed when the saws bit, and the sawdust smelled of copper and frangipani. The radio never stopped screaming, not really. Old operators in Fiji swear that on quiet nights, when the atmospherics are right, you can still tune to 2182 kHz and hear her, one long, endless distress tone underneath which, if you press your ear to the speaker and hold your breath, 25 voices are still trying to finish a song that started with laughter and ended in someone else's blood. The Pacific keeps her secret the way a throat keeps a scream it never let out, and somewhere beneath the new paint and the tourists and the cruise ships, Joyita waits, half-sunken, unsinkable, patient as bone, for the next merry voyage that forgets the ocean never learned how to share. The first man who dared open Doc Parsons' medical bag after the tow back to Suva was a young naval surgeon named Lieutenant Harry Langham, 28 years old, fresh from Korea, convinced he'd already seen every way a human being could be broken. He laid the bag on the dock under a single naked bulb, the kind that swings in the tropical night and makes shadows crawl like spiders, and when he snapped the clasps the lid rose with a soft sigh that smelled of iodine and something sweeter. Frangipani left too long in a hot room. Inside, everything was arranged like a surgeon's love letter to order. Scalpels and velvet slots, ampoules of morphine nestled in cotton wool, suture kits still sealed, and in the center, folded with almost tender care, for field dressings so saturated with blood they had fused into a single crimson brick. Harry lifted the top one with forceps, and the underside was still wet, not damp, wet, as if the arteries that fed it had only just been tied off. A single drop rolled off the edge, hung for a heartbeat, then fell onto the teak dock and soaked in so fast the wood looked thirsty. Harry's hands started shaking so badly the forceps clattered, because the print pressed into that top bandage was perfect. Dusty Miller's right hand, wedding band marked clear, lifeline broken in the exact spot where a marlin spike had once sliced him in 49. But Dusty had been left-handed. Everyone knew that. Everyone. They worked through the night under floodlights that turned the Joyita into a floating autopsy, men in white coats and men in uniform moving like ghosts themselves, cataloging every impossible detail because the alternative was admitting the ocean had invented new rules. The mattresses, 16 of them, were slashed open and the cork granules poured out in slow golden avalanches, yet not one scrap of cloth, not one button, not one tooth remained of the 25 people who had slept on them. The ship's clock in the wheelhouse had stopped at 3:47 a.m., the exact minute Dusty changed course to run for shelter. But the second hand was still twitching, a millimeter forward, a millimeter back, like a heart refusing the diagnosis. Someone found Charlie the cook's ladle wedged behind the stove, handle wrapped in a child's hair ribbon, pink to his favorite, the metal bent into a perfect circle as if tiny fingers had tied it in a bow. The galley fridge still hummed on phantom power, and inside were 2 plates of wahoo curry, forks laid neatly across them, food untouched but warm to the touch, steam curling up when the door opened as if dinner had just been served. The lifeboats were the cruelest joke. All 4 were missing. Davits swung out, falls cut clean with something that left mirror-bright edges. No axe aboard could do that, no knife either. Yet the starboard quarter held a child's inflatable ring, the kind sold in Apia for 6 pence, still fully inflated, still tied to the rail with a perfect clove hitch Roland Wilson had taught his son the week before sailing. The knot was wet. Not salt wet, fresh wet, as if a small tongue had only just licked it tight. Down in the engine room the gray marine sat pristine, oil clean, fuel tanks 3/4 full, starter motor still warm when the mechanic laid his palm against it. Someone had drawn a smiley face in the condensation on the gauge glass, 2 dots and a curve, and when the man breathed on it the smile grew teeth. The bilge pumps were running, click, 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 sucking nothing but air because the waterline was now above the floor plates, yet the cork refused to let her sink another inch, as if the ship had decided halfway was enough. On the bulkhead beside the throttle, Doc Parsons had written in his neat doctor's script, "Bleeding won't stop. Source unknown. Patient not aboard." Below that, in the same blue ink but shaking now, they took the children first. The blood was everywhere and nowhere. Swabs taken from the saloon ceiling came back human, type O positive, Dusty's type, Doc's type, the boxer's type, half the passenger list. But the quantity was wrong. 25 adults hold about 150 liters between them, yet the decks held barely 5. It was as if the ocean had sipped them and found the vintage not to its taste. In the honeymoon cabin they found the wife's wedding veil nailed to the overhead with a scalpel, fabric still dripping slow red tears that pattered onto the bunk below and vanished before they hit the mattress. The husband's watch lay on the pillow, crystal cracked, hands frozen at 4:02 a.m., second hand racing backwards so fast it hummed. They brought dogs aboard, 3 German shepherds trained for cadaver search, and the animals went mad within minutes, clawing at the cork lining until their paws bled, whining at corners where no corner existed, finally curling into trembling balls and refusing to move. One bitch lifted her head and howled at the exact spot where the Wilson family berth had been, a sound so raw the handler vomited on the spot. When they dragged the dogs off, each one carried a single frangipani petal in its mouth, pink, perfect, smelling of Tua's hair. The radio room was the worst. The transmitter had finally died when they cut the battery leads, but the paper tape on the receiver kept printing, spooling onto the deck in slow white ribbon. Sad face help the baby is crying in the walls. Over and over, in perfect Morse, no operator touching the key. A technician traced the signal and found it wasn't coming from the set at all. It was being induced in the copper wiring of the ship herself, as if Joyita had learned to speak in code.